Welcome back. Today we are using two event recaps as a lens for a bigger debate: ETHConf 2026 in New York and ETHMilan 2026 in Italy. One looked like Ethereum opening the door to Wall Street. The other looked like Europe trying to make crypto feel culturally and institutionally legitimate. So the question is not just which event was better. It is what these two events say about the American and European crypto scenes right now.
And I think that is the right framing. Because these events were not simply two versions of the same thing. ETHConf felt like a conversion event for institutions. It had the scale, the capital, the regulators, the infrastructure players, and the sense that crypto has moved beyond introductions. ETHMilan was different. It was smaller, more cultural, more European in the way it tried to make blockchain feel connected to public life, regulation, philosophy, and place.
That contrast is exactly why I wanted to debate them. Because when people talk about crypto conferences, they often reduce everything to attendance numbers, speaker names, side events, and sponsor logos. But these two recaps suggest something deeper. In America, the question seems to be whether crypto can absorb institutional capital. In Europe, the question seems to be whether crypto can earn social legitimacy.
Yes, and the tension is that both sides need what the other side has. The American scene is very good at scale, money, market structure, and turning a narrative into a serious business category. But it can become sterile. It can feel like the community is being invited back into its own house as a guest. Europe, on the other hand, is very good at context. It asks where the technology sits in society, law, culture, and history. But it can lack the same force of capital and execution.
So let us start with ETHConf. The recap makes a pretty bold argument. Ethereum built the stage, but Wall Street took it. That is a sharp line. Do you read that as criticism or as a sign that the ecosystem has matured?
Honestly, both. It is criticism, because there is something strange about an Ethereum conference where the most important energy comes from BlackRock, DTCC, the SEC, SWIFT, institutional allocators, and private capital dinners. But it is also maturity, because this is what every serious infrastructure technology eventually wants. You do not build settlement rails, stablecoin systems, tokenized securities, and institutional DeFi forever, just to keep explaining wallets to curious beginners.
Right.
The recap makes clear that ETHConf was not a Blockchain 101 event. That matters. The panels were not asking whether blockchains are real. They were asking how trust frameworks from traditional market infrastructure map onto on-chain systems, how tokenized securities should be regulated, and what it means when large allocators are no longer experimenting, but actually preparing to move size.
That is a real shift. For years, crypto conferences had this slightly awkward ritual where TradFi people came on stage and everyone treated it like proof of legitimacy. A bank executive would say something cautious about blockchain, the audience would applaud, and people would tweet that adoption was coming. ETHConf sounds like the moment after that. Adoption is not coming. It is sitting in the front row asking operational questions.
Exactly. And that changes the emotional tone. When institutions are only tourists, the crypto crowd can feel superior. It can say, they are late. They are learning from us. They need us. But when institutions arrive with capital, lawyers, distribution, compliance teams, and operational demands, the power balance changes. Suddenly the question becomes, can the crypto infrastructure actually meet the standards of the people it spent years trying to attract?
That is where I think the Swift fireside in the recap is important. The title was basically asking what will not settle. That is a very different kind of skepticism from the old dismissive skepticism. It is not saying blockchain is fake. It is saying, okay, if these are the new rails, where do they still fail compared with the old ones?
And that is the most useful kind of skepticism. The crypto industry is used to defending itself against people who never took it seriously. But this is a more uncomfortable challenge because it comes from people who understand the old system deeply. They are not asking whether the technology is interesting. They are asking what happens under stress. What happens with legal finality? What happens with privacy? What happens when real-world obligations do not fit neatly into smart contract logic?
That feels like the American scene at its best. Direct, commercial, practical, maybe even a little brutal. The question is not whether the idea is beautiful. The question is whether it can carry weight.
Yes. And ETHConf seemed designed around that pressure. The main stage gave the clean institutional story, but the side events told you where the real conversations were happening. Private coffees for network operators, investor breakfasts, curated dinners for founders building on crypto rails, closed-door conversations about privacy, compliance, and adoption. That is not just networking. That is the real market trying to form around the public narrative.
I agree.
And the most revealing detail is that the most substantive institutional conversation happened after the conference ended, at an invite-only dinner with allocators, fund managers, and DeFi native operators. No panels, no decks, no social media performance. That tells you something. The public event creates the map, but the private rooms decide where the money might actually go.
That is also where I start to get uneasy. Because if the real conference is behind closed doors, what happens to the public conference? Does it become theater? Does the community become atmosphere? You still need the developers, the culture, the people who kept Ethereum alive through the weird years. But at ETHConf, at least from this recap, they do not seem like the main characters anymore.
That is fair, but I would push back slightly. A maturing ecosystem naturally creates layers. You need the open source contributor working out of the Protocol Labs hub. You need the builder knight experimenting with agentic tech. You need the institutional allocator asking about on-chain credit. You need the regulator thinking through tokenized securities. The problem is not that those layers exist. The problem is when they stop talking to each other.
And the recap suggests they were already somewhat split before ETHConf even began. The night before, there was a stablecoin dinner for founders and capital allocators, while Protocol Labs opened a hub for open source contributors and builders. Same week, same ecosystem, two different gravitational fields.
That is the perfect image. One room is payments infrastructure, capital, stablecoins, and allocators. The other is contributors, open source, and builders needing a place to work. Both are necessary, but the fact that they start separately tells you what the event is trying to hold together. ETHConf is not just a conference. It is a negotiation between Ethereum as a public technology movement and Ethereum as financial infrastructure.
That is the tension.
And to be clear, that negotiation is not a failure. It may be the only realistic future. If Ethereum wants to be settlement infrastructure, then Wall Street showing up is not a betrayal of the thesis. It is evidence that the thesis has consequences. The question is whether Ethereum can absorb that attention without losing the parts of itself that made it different from the financial system it is trying to improve.
Now let us put ETHMilan beside that. Because Milan feels like almost the opposite move. Instead of saying, look, we have BlackRock and DTCC, it's saying, look, we are inside the Museo Nazionale della Scienza e della Tecnologia Leonardo da Vinci. We are literally putting crypto inside a national science museum named after Italy's most famous polymath.
That venue does a lot of work. It gives the event symbolic seriousness before anyone says a word. A crypto conference in a museum is making a claim about continuity. It is saying this technology belongs in the same civic imagination as science, invention, design, engineering, and culture. That is very different from the Javits Center energy of ETHConf, which is more about scale, logistics, and institutional density.
And ETHMilan seems self-aware about that. The recap argues that culture is not decoration for this conference. Back in 2024, it already had create and inspire tracks, one technical and one cultural. In 2026, it puts a philosophy of blockchain lecture in the same building as a derivatives summit.
That is such a European move, and I mean that with affection. A philosopher and a derivatives panel under the same roof would feel incoherent at many crypto conferences. In Milan, it becomes the point. The event is saying that DeFi infrastructure can sit next to philosophy, that financial engineering can sit next to public meaning, and that blockchain is not only a market tool, but something that needs to be interpreted culturally.
Exactly.
But I also think we have to be careful not to romanticize it. Culture can open doors, but it does not automatically build liquidity. A lecture by a respected philosopher can make an academic or institutional visitor feel comfortable entering the room, and that has real value. But if the event wants to claim Milan as a European crypto hub, it still has to answer harder questions about capital, regulation, banking relationships, founders, and long-term ecosystem depth.
That is where the recap is very balanced. It says the claim that Milan is an emerging European hub deserves scrutiny. Italy is not the obvious center of European crypto finance. Other jurisdictions have deeper banking infrastructure. But the more modest claim that Milan has cemented itself as the DeFi capital of Italy in southern Europe feels more credible.
And that is a much stronger claim because it is specific. Every city wants to call itself a hub. Hub language is cheap. But saying Milan has a real position in Italy and southern Europe is more grounded. It lets the event build from what is actually there: a cultural capital, a design and finance city, a regulatory conversation shaped by Europe, and a conference that can convene people who might not attend a pure trading event.
So here's my challenge to you. Is ETHMilan more interesting than ETHConf precisely because it has not been fully captured by institutions yet? The recap keeps coming back to proximity. Lawyers, developers, philosophers, traders, sponsors, community people, all bumping into each other at the espresso cart. That messiness feels alive.
It does. And I think ETHMilan's best quality is that it has not over-optimized the audience. At ETHConf, the categories are clearer: allocator, regulator, infrastructure provider, founder, developer, policymaker. At ETHMilan, the categories blur more. Someone may be there for MiCA, someone for art and storytelling, someone for DeFi derivatives, someone for the Pizza DAO party, someone for the AI agent hackathon happening around the broader Milan Tech Week. That creates collisions.
Right.
And collisions are underrated. A lot of conferences try to reduce friction because friction is inconvenient. But sometimes the friction is the product. The regulatory lawyer overhears the anonymous developer. The cultural visitor realizes the derivatives panel is not just casino talk. The DeFi trader sees that public legitimacy matters. That is how a scene becomes more than a marketplace.
That makes the 2027 plan interesting. ETHMilan announced it wants to reorganize into 3 tracks: enterprise, institutional, and community. On paper, that sounds like growth and clarity, but the recap is skeptical. It says that might remove the one quality that made 2026 work.
I share that skepticism. Tracks can be useful, but they can also create social walls. If enterprise people only talk to enterprise people, institutional people only talk to institutional people, and community people are given their own separate zone, the event becomes cleaner but less alive. The magic of ETHMilan was that the philosopher, the derivatives trader, the lawyer, and the builder were all part of the same physical story.
And that is a bigger Europe versus America question. America often scales by segmentation. You identify the buyer, create the track, optimize the funnel, close the deal. Europe, at least in this Milan example, seems to gain power from not separating things too quickly.
Yes, although Europe also has plenty of bureaucratic segmentation. But in this case, the European strength is integration. ETHMilan is trying to say that crypto belongs inside civic space. It belongs inside a museum, inside legal debate, inside philosophical inquiry, inside public culture. That is not always efficient, but it can create a deeper kind of legitimacy than simply saying a large asset manager appeared on stage.
Totally.
At the same time, America's institutional scene has its own legitimacy. We should not pretend that capital does not matter. When BlackRock, DTCC, the SEC, SWIFT, and major stablecoin infrastructure players are on the agenda, they bring a different kind of validation. They signal that the technology has crossed into the realm of systems that governments, banks, and markets have to take seriously.
So maybe the difference is that the American scene asks, can crypto become market infrastructure? The European scene asks, can crypto become part of society?
That is a clean way to put it, and both questions are incomplete alone. Market infrastructure without social legitimacy becomes a back-end for powerful institutions. Social legitimacy without capital and adoption becomes a beautiful conversation that does not change much. The future probably belongs to ecosystems that can combine both. Serious rails and serious meaning.
Let us talk about AI, because both recaps include it, but neither frames it as the main stage story. At ETHConf, AI was in the margins. Encrypted apps, agentic tech, autonomous payment infrastructure, AI-powered trading, agents trusted with capital. At ETHMilan, the AI agent hackathon happened at a separate venue as part of Milan AI Week.
That pattern is fascinating. AI is present, but it is not fully absorbed into the official story. In both events, the builders seem ahead of the conference narrative. The main stages are still dominated by institutions, regulation, DeFi, stablecoins, tokenization, and legitimacy. But in the side rooms and hackathons, people are already asking how autonomous agents pay, trade, verify, attack, defend, and coordinate on-chain.
And in the ETHConf recap, one of the most interesting details is that the prominent AI commerce event happened at Solana Skyline, and the only hackathon happened on Monad. That is a reminder that Ethereum does not own the agentic future just because it owns a lot of the institutional conversation.
Yes, that detail matters because it punctures ecosystem arrogance. Ethereum may be where Wall Street is comfortable talking about settlement, tokenized securities, and DeFi infrastructure. But AI commerce, agentic payments, and autonomous systems may develop across chains, across ecosystems, and in places that are faster or more experimental. The future does not respect conference branding.
That is sharp.
It is also a warning for both Europe and America. In America, institutions can make an event feel important, even if the most experimental builders are elsewhere. In Europe, culture can make an event feel meaningful, even if the frontier technical work is happening in another venue. So both scenes have to ask whether their official stages are keeping up with where developer energy is moving.
That brings me to side events more broadly. I always think side events are where a conference tells the truth about itself. Main stages are curated. Side events reveal incentives. ETHConf side events were institutional rooms and capital deal flow. ETHMilan side events were rooftop parties, community runs, DeFi gatherings, AI hackathons, sponsor activations, pizza DAO, and a tram party.
That comparison is perfect. ETHConf's side event map says the institutions are not just visiting. They are organizing themselves. They are meeting privately, filtering for seniority, and creating rooms where actual allocation and strategy can be discussed. ETHMilan's side event map says the ecosystem is still social, cultural, local, and a bit chaotic. People are running through Parco Sempione, drinking espresso, taking photos in a museum courtyard, going to rooftop activations, and ending up on a tram with DeFi people.
And yet both have private rooms. That is important. Milan may be warmer, but the recap still mentions small, invite-only DeFi gatherings that probably produce more deals than posts. So we should not pretend Europe is all public culture and America is all closed-door capital.
Absolutely. Every serious scene has layers of access. The difference is the surface story. At ETHConf, the private rooms feel like the natural extension of the event's institutional thesis. At ETHMilan, the private rooms sit inside a broader civic and cultural wrapper. The conference wants to look like a public bridge, even while the protocol people still prefer their own smaller circles.
I like that distinction. Private rooms as the thesis versus private rooms inside a bigger public wrapper.
Exactly.
Now let me argue for the American model for a second, even though I have been more sympathetic to Milan. The ETHConf recap says the introductory era is over. That is a huge achievement. If crypto conferences are still explaining what a blockchain is in 2026, that would be a failure. Maybe the Wall Street takeover is not capture. Maybe it is the point of all the infrastructure work.
I think that is the strongest defense of ETHConf. Crypto spent years complaining that institutions did not understand it, regulators were confused, and traditional finance dismissed the technology. Then, the institutions arrive, the regulators get specific, the market infrastructure people engage, and suddenly the community worries that the room feels too institutional. You cannot ask to be taken seriously and then be surprised when serious actors show up with serious demands.
And serious demands are not always bad. They can force better systems. If you are building credit markets at internet speed, tokenized securities, stablecoin payments, or on-chain settlement, you probably need the boring questions. Compliance, privacy, failure modes, legal enforceability, operational risk. Those questions may not make the most exciting panels, but they decide whether the rails can hold.
Yes, and that phrase, whether the rails can hold, is the heart of ETHConf. The institutions are permanent now. The recap says no cycle washes them out. I think that is true. Even if prices fall, even if narratives change, the institutional learning does not fully disappear. The question is whether the technology can support the weight that these actors are preparing to place on it.
Now let me argue for the European model. ETHMilan understands something that the American scene sometimes forgets. Finance alone is not enough to make a technology socially durable. If crypto is always presented as a market structure upgrade, then the public only sees speculation, banks, funds, and infrastructure. Milan tries to place crypto in a longer story about invention, culture, and public institutions.
That is the strongest defense of ETHMilan. The museum is not a superficial detail. The philosophy lecture is not just intellectual decoration. The pizza DAO moment is not just a party. Together, they say that crypto has rituals, history, culture, and civic aspirations. Europe is often slower to financialize everything, and in this case, that slowness can be productive. It forces the industry to explain why it belongs in society, not just why it can generate yield.
Yes.
But again, the risk is that cultural legitimacy becomes a substitute for hard adoption. It is possible to have a beautiful conference, a meaningful venue, thoughtful panels, and still not have enough capital formation, startup density, or market influence to shape the global direction of crypto. The Milan claim works best when it is humble. Not Europe's crypto crown outright, but a serious bid from Italy and Southern Europe.
The title of the recap calls it a bid for Europe's crypto crown. And I think that word bid is doing a lot of work. It is not saying Milan has won. It is saying Milan is making a claim. And the claim is partly symbolic. We can host crypto in a way that feels more culturally intelligent than the average trade show.
And that matters because events are not neutral. The way you stage a conference teaches people how to understand the industry. If you stage it around Wall Street, people understand crypto as financial infrastructure. If you stage it inside a science museum, with philosophers, lawyers, designers, DeFi builders, and community rituals, people understand crypto as a broader social technology. Neither frame is complete, but each frame attracts different people.
That point about attracting different people is key. ETHConf attracts people who can move markets, write rules, allocate capital, and build institutional pipes. ETHMilan attracts people who might not identify first as crypto native, Academics, legal thinkers, cultural operators, designers, maybe public sector adjacent people. Those people matter if crypto wants to escape its own echo chamber.
They do. And the European regulatory context matters too. MiCA gives the EU a single written crypto asset regime, which gives European events a different kind of policy backdrop. In the US, the regulatory mood has often been fragmented, adversarial, or dependent on agency interpretation. In Europe, even if the rules are imperfect, the existence of a shared framework gives conferences a more concrete legal language to work with.
That is another contrast. ETHConf has the SEC on stage, which is powerful because it shows direct engagement. ETHMilan has lawyers discussing MiCA, which is powerful because it shows a rulebook already shaping the conversation. One is about negotiating with power. The other is about operating within a defined framework.
Nicely put. And that shapes the mood. American crypto often feels like it is fighting for permission, even when it is wealthy and influential. European crypto often feels like it is trying to interpret a framework, find its place, and build credibility through compliance and public seriousness. That does not mean Europe is easier. It means the political texture is different.
Right.
And the event design reflects that. ETHConf's energy is, it's the big actors are here. The rails are being tested. The capital is ready. Now prove the system works. ETHMilan's energy is, this technology can belong in a European civic, cultural, and regulatory environment, but we have to show that it is more than speculation. Those are two very different forms of seriousness.
Let us talk about community, because both recaps end with community in different ways. ETHConf closes with Brooklyn energy, rooftop music, an NBA Finals watch party, public records, DJ sets, the sense that after the institutions had the official program, the last night belonged to the community. ETHMilan closes with Pizza DAO and a DeFi tram party moving through the city.
Those endings say a lot. ETHConf's community ending almost feels like a return. The formal program belongs to the institutions. Then the week crosses into Brooklyn and remembers the human scene underneath the infrastructure. ETHMilan's community moments feel more integrated into the city itself. Pizza history inside an Ethereum venue, a tram party moving through Milan, the museum as a backdrop. The community is not just an after-party. It is part of the city choreography.
That is a beautiful way to say it. But I wonder if ETHConf's ending is more honest. Maybe in a huge institutional event, community naturally becomes the after-hours layer. It is not necessarily bad. It is just what happens when the official agenda is dominated by capital and policy.
Maybe, but the risk is that after-hours community becomes symbolic compensation. You let the institutions own the serious hours, and then the community gets the vibe hours. That division can work for a while, but over time, it may create resentment. Builders and community members do not want to be only the aesthetic backdrop for institutional adoption. They want agency in defining what adoption should mean.
That is fair.
At the same time, community also has to mature. It cannot demand global relevance and then reject every institution that arrives. The more interesting question is how to design events where community, builders, regulators, and capital allocators remain in real conversation. ETHMilan accidentally or deliberately did that through proximity. ETHConf did it through scale, but the layers were more separated.
So if you were advising ETHConf, what would you tell them? How do they keep the institutional strength without making the event feel like Ethereum rented out its identity to Wall Street?
I would tell them to create more formats where institutional people have to engage with builders in public, not just on panels, but in problem-solving sessions. Less polished thought leadership, more direct friction. For example, take the Swift-style question, what will not settle, and put protocol developers, market infrastructure people, legal experts, and DeFi operators together around specific failure scenarios. Make the institution builder conversation the main event, not a side channel.
That would make the conference feel less like a parade of adoption and more like a working session.
Exactly. Adoption theater is easy. Productive conflict is harder. ETHConf has enough heavyweight participation that it can afford to be more demanding. If BlackRock, DTCC, the SEC, Swift, Chainlink, Aave, Securitize, stablecoin companies, and DeFi teams are in the ecosystem conversation, don't just let them explain their vision. Force the hard questions into the open.
And if you were advising ETHMilan?
I would say protect the mess. Do not over-separate the audiences. The planned enterprise, institutional, and community tracks may help with programming, but the organizers should design intentional overlaps. Shared breakfasts, mixed roundtables, cross-track debates, common social spaces, maybe even sessions that require a lawyer, a developer, a cultural thinker, and an investor to respond to the same prompt. The thing that makes Milan special is not that it has many audiences. It is that those audiences can collide.
That is probably the biggest lesson for event organizers generally. The best conferences are not only content schedules. They are social architectures. They decide who is allowed to meet whom, who feels important, who feels peripheral, and what kinds of conversations can happen.
Yes, and that is why these two recaps are useful. ETHConf shows what happens when institutional finance becomes the dominant audience. ETHMilan shows what happens when culture and legitimacy are treated as central to the event's identity. Neither is simply better, but each reveals a different answer to the question, what does crypto need next?
And what does it need next?
It needs infrastructure that can handle serious capital without becoming merely an extension of the old financial system. It needs regulation that protects users without freezing experimentation. It needs culture that makes the technology legible to normal people without turning everything into symbolism. It needs builders who can work with institutions without becoming subordinate to them. And it needs events that do not just celebrate adoption, but actively shape the kind of adoption we get.
I like that. It also makes me think the America versus Europe frame is useful but limited. The danger is turning it into a personality contest. America is not only Wall Street, and Europe is not only museums and regulation. Both scenes contain builders, capital, culture, speculation, policy, community, and ego.
Completely. The frame is useful because it highlights tendencies, not because it explains everything. The American tendency, at least in the ETHConf recap, is towards scale, institutional adoption, private capital flow, and market infrastructure. The European tendency, at least in the ETHMilan recap, is toward cultural framing, legal context, civic symbolism, and mixed audiences. But every real ecosystem is messier than that.
So maybe the real debate is not Europe versus America. It is what kind of maturity crypto wants. Does maturity mean being accepted by Wall Street? Does it mean being accepted by public institutions and culture? Does it mean better technology, better regulation, better community spaces?
And the answer is probably yes to all of those, but not equally in every place. ETHConf is mature in the sense that the adult financial world has arrived and is speaking in specifics. ETHMilan is mature in the sense that it is trying to place crypto in a broader social and intellectual setting. One maturity is operational. The other is contextual.
Operational maturity versus contextual maturity. That is a strong distinction.
It helps explain why both events can feel important and incomplete. ETHConf can tell you that the rails are being taken seriously, but it may leave you wondering whether the original community still has enough influence. ETHMilan can tell you that crypto can be culturally intelligent and locally grounded, but it may leave you wondering whether the hub claim has enough financial weight behind it.
Let us make the debate sharper. If you had to choose which event better represents the future of crypto conferences, which one would you pick?
For the next few years, ETHConf. Not because I find it more inspiring, but because institutional adoption is going to dominate the industry's external narrative. Tokenized assets, stablecoins, on-chain credit, settlement, compliance, and market infrastructure are where governments, banks, and large companies are paying attention. Conferences that can convene those actors will shape the language of legitimacy.
I think I would pick ETHMilan, but for a different reason. ETHConf may represent where the money is going, but ETHMilan represents what crypto events need to become if they want to avoid becoming industry conventions for financial plumbing. The Milan model says the setting, the culture, the city, and the mix of people still matter.
That is a compelling argument. And maybe the answer depends on what we mean by future. If we mean where the largest capital flows and regulatory negotiations happen, the ETHConf model wins. If we mean how crypto remains culturally alive, accessible, and capable of attracting people outside the financial machine, the ETHMilan model has a stronger claim.
So we are both right.
Conveniently, yes.
But let me push one more time. Could ETHMilan's cultural framing be seen as a cover for weakness? Like, if you do not have the deepest institutional bench, you talk about philosophy in museums. If you do not have the biggest allocators, you talk about civic legitimacy. Is that too cynical?
It is cynical, but not useless. Cultural framing can absolutely become compensation. An event can use beauty, history, and intellectual language to make a smaller commercial footprint feel more important than it is. But in ETHMilan's case, I do not think it is only cover. The recap shows that the event also had regulated finance, 21 shares, stablecoin liquidity conversations, MiCA lawyers, DeFi trading infrastructure, and invite-only protocol gatherings. The culture is not replacing finance. It is softening and contextualizing it.
That nuance matters. And we can make the opposite critique of ETHConf. Institutional scale can also be a cover. You can put famous financial names on stage and create the feeling of inevitability, even if the underlying technology still has unresolved issues around settlement, privacy, security, regulation, and user experience.
Exactly. Big names can become a kind of theater too. That is why the former Swift executive's question is so valuable. It interrupts the inevitability narrative. It says, before we declare victory, let us name what these rails still cannot do. It should create conditions where prestigious speakers can be challenged.
That is the standard both events should be held to. ETHConf should not just showcase institutional adoption, it should test it. ETHMilan should not just showcase cultural legitimacy, it should prove that the culture connects to durable ecosystem growth.
Yes, and if both events do that, they become complementary. ETHConf can pressure the technology to meet institutional reality. ETHMilan can pressure the industry to remember public meaning. One asks, can the system settle? The other asks, can the system belong?
That is a great line.
And it captures the regional contrast without flattening it. America is not soulless, and Europe is not impractical. But the two recaps show different centers of gravity. New York is asking whether Ethereum can support the financial world's next rails. Milan is asking whether crypto can be taken seriously as part of European public, cultural, and regulatory life.
Before we close, let us do a quick recap of the main takeaways. First, ETHConf shows that the introductory era is over. The major institutions are no longer asking what blockchain is. They are asking how to use it, regulate it, allocate to it, and test its limits.
Second, ETHMilan shows that cultural legitimacy is not a side issue. The museum setting, the philosophy lecture, the MiCA conversations, the DeFi panels, the community events, and the city itself all helped frame crypto as something broader than trading or financial engineering.
Third, the side events may reveal more than the official programs. ETHConf's private allocator dinners and institutional rooms showed where capital conversations were happening. ETHMilan's runs, rooftops, hackathons, sponsor activations, pizza gathering, and tram party showed a more social and local ecosystem, but still with its own private DeFi layers.
Fourth, AI is present but still not fully centered. In both recaps, AI lives around the edges. Agentic payments, trading agents, encrypted apps, autonomous commerce, hackathons, security, and verification. That suggests the builder frontier may be moving faster than the official conference narratives.
And fifth, the real question is not which scene wins. It is whether crypto can combine the American strength of institutional scale with the European strength of cultural and regulatory grounding.
Exactly. The industry needs both. It needs the capital rooms and the espresso cart. It needs the allocator dinner and the public museum. It needs the regulator and the anonymous developer. It needs the polished main stage and the strange side event where the next important idea appears before anyone knows how to brand it.
That may be the best image to end on. Crypto grows through infrastructure, but it stays alive through collisions. ETHConf and ETHMilan show two different ways those collisions can happen, and two different risks if they stop happening.
ETHConf's risk is becoming too institutional, too clean, too dominated by the people with capital. ETHMilan's risk is becoming too segmented, too aspirational, or too proud of its cultural wrapper. But both events are clearly trying to answer the same underlying question. What does crypto look like after the early era?
And maybe the answer is that it looks less like one scene and more like many scenes learning from each other. New York brings the weight, Milan brings the texture. The strongest future probably borrows from both.
I would agree with that.
That is where we will leave it. ETHConf showed a world where Wall Street is no longer outside the door. ETHMilan showed a world where crypto is still trying to earn a place inside culture, law, and civic life. The debate between those worlds is not a distraction. It is the work.
And it is. It is a debate worth continuing, because the answer will shape not only what crypto events feel like, but what the industry becomes.
Beautifully said. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you. This was fun.